Welcome to Applying Decision-Making Insights to Strengthen Anti-Poverty Efforts. I'm your host, Andy King, at AmeriCorps Vista headquarters in Washington, D.C. I'm joined by our production team at Education Northwest in Portland, Oregon, Bethany DeSablin and Joanne Lau. You'll see all of us in the chat and the Q&A to support you during the session. Let's start by looking at the goals for this webinar. We hope that by the end of the session, you'll be able to identify the factors that influence our ability to make informed decisions and then understand why people in general often struggle in the face of complex decisions. We also hope you'll be able to explain how scarcity of various forms, whether financial, cognitive, or even sleep deprivation, can inhibit our ability to make informed decisions. Beyond that, you'll be able to describe concrete solutions that address these behavioral obstacles and that can aid people with decision-making. We also hope you'll be able to share new ways to apply behavioral insights to design scalable solutions across a range of poverty-related domains. And finally, you'll leave this session ready to connect the concepts and solutions that you learn here to your VISTA service. Let's take a quick look at the agenda. We'll start out with an overview of how people make decisions. Then we'll take a look at factors that can inhibit informed decision-making. From there, we'll offer an overview of strategies to support more informed decisions and discuss how these strategies could address some common challenges confronting the poor. And then, of course, we'll pause to see what questions you have. So now it's time to meet our speaker. I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Ben Castleman. Ben is an assistant professor of education and public policy at the University of Virginia. Ben's research applies insights from behavioral economics and social psychology to improve college access and success for low-income and non-traditional students. He's the author of several books and has presented his research at a White House symposium and in testimony before Congress. Most importantly, at least in my book, Ben is an AmeriCorps alum, having served 2 terms of AmeriCorps service in the state of Rhode Island. So now it's my pleasure to turn things over to Dr. Ben Castleman.
Great. Thank you so much, Andy, for the generous introduction, and thank you to all of the participants who've taken time out of your day to be with us. As a former AmeriCorps member myself, as Andy said, I'm really thrilled to be with you here today, both to share, hopefully, some useful information, but as importantly, or more importantly, to engage with you about how these insights might apply to your work in VISTA programs. Now, to get us started, I imagine some of you, hopefully enthusiastically, signed up for this webinar a few weeks ago, or maybe even longer. But once today arrived, once this morning started and you looked at your calendar for the day, you might have felt the pinch of having a bunch of other tasks that you had to get done. If that's the case, no need to worry. This tendency to want to do things when we can look at them a bit off in the future, but to feel more reluctant when the time actually arrives, and we're faced with pressing demands in our time, is one of the common behavioral responses that we're going to spend time discussing on this webinar. Now, on to some other common behavioral responses. All of us, the couple hundred of us on this webinar right now, at some time or another, all of us confront complex tasks or decisions. And so as a way of kind of getting you engaged from the beginning in the webinar, we'd like to ask, or I'd like to ask, what's a complex decision that you've encountered where you either had trouble sorting out what choice to make, or there was an intention that you had a hard time following through on. So I'm hoping that some of you will be willing to share your thoughts via chat. To do so, please enter your ideas in the chat box and make sure you send to all participants. And Bethany is going to post that same question that I just posed into the chat field right now.
All right, so we've got the question up there. If you don't see the chat window, again, look in the upper right corner of your screen. You'll see a little speech bubble icon and the word chat. Click that to open the chat panel. And now we've got responses coming in very quickly. Looks like everything from school decisions, university decisions, to how we spend money, spending versus savings, and how those decisions get made, deciding to relocate in order to do AmeriCorps service.
Great. Well, I'm also trying to prevent myself from being distracted by all of these great ideas. I really appreciate everyone sharing. I hope what this speaks to is that the challenge of kind of navigating complex decisions or following through our intentions is fundamentally a very human experience. These are challenges that I think we can all relate to, and hopefully because we have that personal experience, it helps gives us insight and understanding to how we might support the individuals that we're working with in VISTA programs or otherwise to navigate decisions they face. So as Andy mentioned, the challenges people face completing complex tasks is the focus of much of my own research, and honestly, something that I'm very conscious of wrestling with myself. As a very concrete example, a couple years back, spring of 2017, I was writing a book on this very subject, on behavioral economics applied to education. And I think I did all the right things planning-wise in advance of writing the book. So, I looked at my calendar for the next few months. I set aside big chunks of time each week to work on it, well before the draft was due to my editor. But of course, when each of those time blocks arrived, they somehow had gotten much shorter than I had originally intended. I wound up carving out portions of those blocks I had set aside for what became pressing calls and meetings. And even within the time that I set aside, I found myself constantly pulled away from writing by the steady stream of notifications, email, Twitter, text, constantly appearing on my computer screen and on my phone. The irony, of course, is that I was writing a book about behavioral economics and knew full well to avoid these kinds of distractions. But I lacked the willpower to turn off the notifications. For me, the allure of new information was just too tempting. So I got the book done, and hopefully it's okay to read at decent quality. But it probably would have been much less stressful for me if I'd managed to be more disciplined about my time and avoid the temptation of new updates to Twitter and the text messages coming in. Hopefully the few minutes that we've just spent with you all sharing some of the complex decisions you've had to navigate, my own reflection, excuse me, illustrate a variety of common behavioral responses that we're going to discuss during the rest of the webinar. So one, the commitments we make for ourselves in the future often come in conflict with our present impulses and desires or needs. Two, distractions often can make it very hard to devote as much time or cognitive bandwidth as we want to completing a task, even if it's a task or an activity we care quite a bit about. And finally, we're not always, or we're sometimes overly optimistic. We're not always realistic about our ability to complete tasks and don't always set aside the time or do the detailed planning needed to follow through on a given action. The way we typically think, or have traditionally, I should say, thought about decision making is really that, we have these kind of logical systems within our brains, and that we're able to, when we need to make a decision, give our logical system full rein. That perspective really emerges largely from the traditional field of economics, which has historically modeled decision-making with the idea that when people make decisions, they kind of impartially assess the benefits and costs of the various options that are available to them, and people are able, in the way that a computer would, to choose the option that maximizes the benefits relative to the costs they might face. In reality, however, we are not just logical beings or logical decision makers. For all of us, impulses, both impulses we're conscious of and sometimes ones we're not, can exert a very strong influence in our decisions. After all, logic may tell us that we should exercise more because the long-term health benefits outweigh the near-term costs, whether those are money costs or time costs or the physical discomfort of going jogging even. But that still doesn't stop our impulsive side from hitting the snooze button in the morning rather than getting up and going running. In the next few slides, I want to give a brief overview of some common ways that those impulsive systems that all of us have can get in the way of our best intentions or prevent us from making informed choices. So one, our present impulses, as I mentioned, often come in conflict with longer-term goals we have for ourselves. When we're faced with complex information or complicated choices, we often use simplifying strategies to make decisions. And finally, we have a very strong tendency as human decision makers to stick with the status quo rather than make a more active choice. So I want to start by discussing this tension between future goals we set for ourselves and impulses that can get in the way of reaching those goals. Again, with a goal and in the spirit of keeping you engaged in the webinar, I'm hoping you'd be willing to share a goal, whether it's personal or professional, that you've set for yourself within the last 6 months. So if you can take a minute, think of a goal, personal or professional, you've set, enter that as we did before in the chat box, and make sure to send to all participants.
All right, so number one, right out of the gate, graduate school and the GRE. I'm sure that's common for a lot of VISTA members. Other things here, work, planning and other issues around work and career, trying to plot some of those things out. Some things related to the gym and getting healthy, similar to what you were mentioning, Ben. Yeah, and then there's also a thread here about some more personal goals around relationships and connecting to the community, practicing music and learning an instrument. So lots of different categories here, but a nice range of goals that are represented here.
Yeah, these are great examples, and as you mentioned, Andy, this really runs the gamut from goals we have for ourselves as individual, we plan to exercise more, but sometimes we have trouble fitting that in. Goals we have for our relationships or our families. We plan to spend more time at home, but we regularly find things come up at work that we feel we have to get done. And of course, the professional goals, graduate school, advancing in one's career. All, I think, very, very common tensions between goals we have and the present impulses we face. So again, in a way that I hope feels very humanizing and relatable, all of us have the experience of conflict between our future and present selves. This is really a tug of war, you could think about, between two systems within our brains. Our planful, our logical system, is really good about making long-term goals like exercising more, spending more time with family that we know and we feel are in our best interests. But we have this other system. It's our impulsive self that has a hard time in the moment saying no to things that either demand our attention or in some fashion that we really crave. This is something that the private sector and the for-profit sector exploits all the time. If you take, for example, Chili's restaurants, which recently installed tablets like you see on your screen at many of their restaurants. One of the things that these tablets do halfway through people enjoying their entrees is start to flash sumptuous, delicious-looking desserts, hoping to tap into our impulsive systems that will order the chocolate chip cookie sundae with the click of a button before our planful system has a chance to kick in and stop us from doing so because we're trying to eat more healthy. A much more policy relevant and serious example is something like payday loans, and we'll come back to that a little later, where lenders offer people cash advances against their paycheck so they can pay what are very real pressing expenses, but that loan is often accompanied by high interest rates, which into the future make the loans difficult to pay off and put people in a bit of a kind of pernicious financial cycle. Our impulses can also lead us to use mental shortcuts or simplifying strategies when making a more informed decision would require us to wade through complicated information and to kind of balance a range of complicated factors. One mental shortcut many of us have is to rely on anchors or high-profile information that kind of literally sticks in our brain. An example of that is something like college tuition. In reality, especially among low-income families, some of whom your VISTA programs might work with, in reality, low-income families pay much less than the list tuition at a college or university, what's sometimes called the sticker price, once financial aid is factored in. But what's discussed in the media, what sticks in people's brains, is the soaring tuition rate, right? So every year we hear that Harvard now costs $62,000. That creates a mental anchor that college is incredibly expensive. College costs $62,000, even if for many low-income families the cost would be quite a bit less. Families who anchor to those media reports may incorrectly conclude that college is unaffordable for them and not apply or not pursue college or financial aid. Finally, as I mentioned, a very common reaction people have when faced with complex decisions is to simply put off making any decision at all. And as a result, we experience whatever outcome results from sticking with that status quo. A very good example of this, this tendency to stick with the status quo, is very widely differing organ donation rates across countries. When you poll people, most people say that in the event of an untimely death, that they would want to donate their organs, particularly, of course, to save someone else's life or to prolong someone else's life. But in countries where people have to actively sign up, fill out a form to be an organ donor, the share of the population on donor registries is very low. However, in countries where people have to actively opt out of being a donor or being on a donor registry, the share of people who is on that registry is very high. And this is not just explained by differences in culture. So if you consider Germany and Austria, two culturally very similar countries, in Germany, people have to actively opt in to be on a donor registry, and as a result of that, only 12% of the population does so. In Austria, people have to opt out if they don't want to be on the registry, and as a function of that, 99% of the population participates. Of course, even in the face of these common behavioral responses, complex decisions still get made. We still manage to complete complex tasks. So I think it's important to think about what are the criteria, what are the situations in which we are more likely to invest time into the decision-making process. One is when we're motivated, right? We're more likely to carefully consider a decision if we believe that investing time and energy will yield positive benefits for ourselves or others. For instance, if we're expecting a tax refund come tax time, we're more likely to devote the time and energy to complete our taxes. When deadlines or decisions are urgent, we also tend to invest more time. So if we face impending deadlines like tax day. And of course, salience can matter quite a bit. So if the consequences of not completing a task or an action are apparent and substantial, like the unwanted phone call none of us wants to receive from the IRS, if we don't file our taxes by April 15th, that can also catalyze us to engage in complex decisions and actions. At the same time, there are also several factors to be aware of that can really inhibit our ability to make careful decisions. One is limited attention, especially given all the distractions we face in modern life, in our work, with our families, and of course through the devices that we find ourselves on all the time. Second, we oftentimes face a multitude of choices, and if we have too many choices, that can inhibit us from making any choice at all. People and adolescents in particular tend to struggle with complex long-term decisions, and part of that is because scarcity, Andy referring to this, scarcity of various forms, cognitive scarcity, financial scarcity, time scarcity, can interfere with our decision-making process. Each of those inhibitors that I've referred to is really a form of scarcity. So you could think of limited attention as scarcity, as attentional scarcity. You could think of adolescence in a way as developmental scarcity. Adolescents' cognitive systems are really just at a point, just beginning to develop in their ability to be planful and long-term in their thinking. And you might think of scarcity more broadly like a tax on your cognitive bandwidth, limiting how much thought or attention you can devote to a given decision. many of you, of course, through the VISTA programs that you participate in and work on, work with people who are experiencing poverty or perhaps near poverty. And poverty is, I think, very important to think of as a particularly pernicious form of scarcity, which can strongly negatively impact people's cognitive performance and their decision-making. When people have to devote a greater portion of their cognitive capacity to worrying about making ends meet on a daily basis, research shows that their cognitive performance suffers. And of course, people in poverty often have less room for error if the decision they make results in a negative outcome. Now, before we go on to the next slide, I want to make a really important distinction. What I'm not saying is that people in poverty have any less cognitive ability or intelligence than more affluent people. Rather, what I mean to say is that whatever cognitive capacity each of us has, anxieties about making ends meet financially take up a substantial portion of our cognitive bandwidth, which uses up mental energy and attention that we then can't devote to other tasks. Now, I want to give you a really concrete illustration of the idea of financial scarcity, and I'm going to do so by drawing on an example from a really seminal book titled Scarcity by the behavioral economist Fendel Mullainathan and his co-author, psychologist Eldar Shafir. Fendel and Eldar and one of their graduate students posed the following scenario, which you can see on your screen, to a randomly selected group of visitors in a New Jersey shopping mall. Imagine your car has some trouble, which requires a $300 service. Your auto insurance will cover half the cost. You need to decide whether to go ahead and get the car fixed or take a chance and hope it lasts a while longer. How would you go about making this decision? Now, Mullainathan and Shafir presented the same scenario to another randomly selected group of mall visitors, but this time you can see the repair bill was $3,000. After each of those scenarios, the authors had administered a very brief cognitive performance assessment. After the first scenario, that $300 repair bill, lower and higher income people performed just about the same on that cognitive assessment. $300 wasn't enough of a stress to alter either group's performance. After the second scenario, however, with the $3,000 bill, the high income people performed just as well as their counterparts had the first time. But for the lower income respondents, they scored substantially lower on the cognitive performance, on the cognitive assessment. Their anxiety about how they would pay for that $3,000 bill took up enough of their cognitive bandwidth, enough of their cognitive attention, that their scores declined by the equivalent of 13 to 14 IQ points. That's about what you get when you administer the same test to someone who stayed up all night compared to someone who got a full night's rest. Andy and I were talking about this before, and he made a great observation. This drop in cognitive performance was from a hypothetical scenario about a $3,000 bill. Imagine how cognitive performance might decline in the face of a real bill of this amount. So I've been talking quite a bit. I want to pause and engage you again and ask you to think about, for a moment, how scarcity, whether it's financial scarcity or attentional scarcity or another form of scarcity that comes to mind for you, might affect the people with whom you work in the VISTA program. So what forms of scarcity do you find people that you work with might encounter? As we did before, please share some of your ideas in the chat box and send to all participants.
All right, so first we're seeing a lot of food scarcity, but also time. You know, people working multiple jobs are having childcare and other responsibilities. Transportation is a theme that's showing up again and again. Of course, the financial scarcity, housing insecurity, and then even here, health issues and medical issues leading to scarcity there around care and either having to take care of family members or no time to take care of your own health. So, yeah, so lots of different dimensions of scarcity that VISTAs are seeing.
Yeah, that's great, very insightful examples. And what I'm struck just watching these flow through on the chat is, of course, how much these compound and magnify each other, right? So someone who's working a couple of jobs and commuting, maybe even trying to continue their education, has very, very little time. So they face tremendous time scarcity. Of course, they might be working those couple jobs because of financial scarcity they face. And so if they have time scarcity, which leads to real kind of limited attention, they can focus on important decisions and events in their lives. They're facing financial scarcity, and perhaps on top of that trying to care for family members. That can exert a real toll, leading to drains on their health and well-being. So great insights. I want to kind of transition from focusing on applying behavioral insights, decision-making insights to help understand the challenges people face, and transition hopefully in a really productive direction. So far I've focused on barriers to and inhibitors of informed decisions, but the good news is that researchers have also developed a variety of concrete strategies to help people overcome these tendencies and make more active and informed decisions. And we've got a pretty robust toolkit at this point. We can change the default condition, change the status quo, so people experience better outcomes if they don't make an active decision. We can promote commitment devices that help people better align their future goals with their present impulses. We can prompt people to follow through on intentions they've set for themselves. We can change the way information is presented, just in its framing, to help people make decisions that better align with their goals and circumstances. We can frame information in a way that's more likely to lead people to take action. We can simply simplify the information or choice that people face, or we can reduce hassles associated with people participating in a program. For the rest of the time that we have, I'm going to try and give you some concrete examples of how these strategies have been applied to poverty reduction policies. Before I do, however, I want to also make another important distinction and clarification. I don't equate these strategies as telling people what they should do or what's best for them. I'm a particularly strong believer myself in helping people follow through on their own intentions that they've set for themselves, or in presenting information in a way that people can make informed choices about what's best for their circumstances. In the slides that follow, I'm going to highlight a number of prominent challenges facing low-income households and individuals that I imagine might arise in your VISTA programs. And then for each challenge, I'm going to briefly discuss a few behaviorally informed solutions that have or that could be applied to address that challenge. I'm going to start with the challenge, of helping lower wage workers accumulate more savings. As many on the webinar probably know, low-wage employers are less likely to offer direct deposit to their employees. Partly owing to the fact that paychecks aren't flowing directly into bank accounts, low-wage workers are also less likely to participate in the banking system. They're also more likely, as we talked about very briefly earlier, to use services like payday lending. The policy challenge, therefore, is how might we encourage higher rates of savings so that lower wage families can avoid debt and have assets for investments they, as individuals, want to make down the road. One strategy we could use is to change the default condition. So employers could be encouraged to at least set up direct deposit, or even have the status quo condition be that paychecks will be direct deposited unless workers actively opt out of this and request a paper check. Direct deposited checks would help connect workers to the banking system, and at least some portion of funds that might otherwise have been spent might now remain as savings. In addition to default strategies, researchers have developed commitment devices to help people align future goals with some of those present impulses we discussed. One example of that at a state level is North Carolina's Salary Advance Loan Program, known as SALO, which is intended as an alternative to traditional payday loans. So workers are still borrowing against their paychecks, but a portion of the loan they take is automatically deposited into a savings account in the worker's name to help them save for a rainy day need down the road. Another commitment device that I think is really important is called the Save More Tomorrow Retirement Strategy. This was developed by Richard Thaler, who recently won the Nobel Prize in Economics for his groundbreaking work in the field of behavioral economics. And in Save More Tomorrow, workers commit a portion of future pay raises to be deposited into a retirement savings account. These funds aren't reflected in the paycheck workers receive after their wage increases, to avoid the resentment our present selves might feel about having a portion of our raises taken away from us, so to speak. Another strategy we can use is to simply prompt people to contribute to savings accounts that they've already set up and have some intention of putting money in. So this has been done in several developing countries where account holders are sent regular text messages reminding them of their savings goals. These really simple text messages, which prompted people to follow through on their own intentions, led to substantially higher savings rates. Another pressing policy issue we face is to improve health outcomes among low-income populations. Low-income individuals, as many of you know, are substantially more likely to experience a variety of chronic health issues like obesity and diabetes, and are less likely, unfortunately, to take advantage of preventive health care opportunities. The policy challenge, therefore, is how we might encourage healthier lifestyles and use of preventive medical care. One strategy I love that researchers have adopted to achieve this policy objective is to just simply change the way that people encounter food on their daily lives. And one of the places that this has been applied is in school cafeterias. When we change the choice architecture, the way that choices and information we face are presented, we're not eliminating certain choices. In this context, chocolate milk, French fries, candy. We're just changing the way people encounter those choices before them. For instance, if we intrusively place a salad bar, like you see in this image, in a cafeteria so that students have to walk around it to get to other food in the cafeteria, rather than having that salad bar hidden away in a corner, what happens is that kids eat more salad. Similarly, if we swap out the snack food at the cash register when kids are paying for fruit, it changes impulse purchases people make when they're paying for their lunch. When there's fruit at the register rather than Cheez-Its, kids will eat more fruit. Most of my own research focuses on how we can improve education for low socioeconomic status, low SDS children. Low SDS children experience substantial achievement gaps at every level of education. They come into kindergarten already substantially behind their more affluent peers on cognitive performance, and unfortunately, on average, remain behind them through high school. Low SDS children are much less likely to earn post-secondary degrees, with gaps actually having widened over time. The policy challenge, then, is how might we help students access high-quality school environments where they're better positioned for success? A team of researchers took what I think is a really fascinating approach to this, to simplifying information for families to help parents prepare their kids for school. In this case, the researchers were focused on encouraging lower-income parents to practice more pre-literacy strategies with their children. Working with the city of San Francisco, the researchers enrolled parents in a text messaging campaign where a few times a week they received text messages with quick pre-literacy strategies they could practice at home. You can see a couple examples on the screen. A Wednesday tip: say 2 words to your child that start with the same sound, like happy and healthy. Ask, can you hear the sound in happy and healthy? Children whose parents received these texts scored substantially higher on cognitive assessments than their counterparts whose parents didn't get the text. Another policy issue I'll discuss is how we might increase participation in various social programs. On their own, low-income families might lack sufficient resources to ensure adequate nutrition or access to a quality education for their children. But across various social programs, there's often a gap between the share of the population that's eligible for a program, like Pell Grants for college, and the share that actually participates. So in this case, the challenge we face is how we might encourage families to participate in social programs that benefit their children. I'm going to start talking for a minute about the free meal program in schools. So as many of you know, public schools offer a national free lunch program, but also a free breakfast program. And while lunch participation rates tend to be very high among eligible kids, breakfast rates are quite a bit lower. In a school that might have 80% of kids eligible for free breakfast, there may only be 30–40% who are eating breakfast. And there's been some very, very interesting strategies to try and address that. So rather than just make breakfast available in a school cafeteria that might not be on the student's way to class, schools are doing innovative things like having breakfast on a cart that's at the front door. So it's very easy. It's kind of part of the child status quo behaviors to walk in the front door, go past the cart, grab breakfast, and in that way increase breakfast participation rates. We're also exploring how we might frame information for school leaders and nutrition personnel to invest more in strategies like these breakfast carts. So a project that we're currently working on is sending information to principals and cafeteria managers about how their breakfast participation rates compare to similar schools like them that have higher breakfast participation rates. These positive social norms, examples of what a peer is doing more effectively, can motivate people to adopt strategies that they might have otherwise been putting off. Prompting strategies can also be quite effective. In my research, my colleagues and I have used text message reminders to encourage students to file the federal financial aid application called FAFSA at the end of high school to complete required financial tasks in order to successfully matriculate for college and to renew their financial aid once they're in college. These text campaigns can cost as little as $5–10 for students, but in certain cases can lead to substantially improved college outcomes. For instance, our texting campaign to encourage college freshmen to renew their federal financial aid increased sophomore year persistence among community college students by almost 25%. Another approach that we can take to help people participate in social programs is to reduce hassles associated with the application process. Whether it's food stamps or financial aid, people often have to complete a fairly cumbersome application in order to receive a benefit, even if much of the information needed to determine their eligibility resides in other government forms that people have already filled out, like tax returns. Steps we can take to reduce hassles, like streamlining applications, pre-populating forms with data we can draw from other sources, or helping people connect to professional advisors who can assist them with applications, can all go a very long way to helping families benefit from the social programs that are available and designed to support them. I've grown increasingly interested in the policy challenge of supporting incarcerated youth and adults to manage their transition from criminal justice facilities back into the community. Oftentimes, unfortunately, this is an area that I am starting to do more and more work in and learn more about. Individuals receive very little in the way of transition support before they're released from jail or prison, and upon returning, may not have great awareness of the community-based resources that are available to help them access supports or navigate their transition. This lack of support around transition may contribute to what are often very high recidivism rates in many communities. One strategy we can use is to make it easier for inmates to get personalized information about where they can access community assistance with concerns that are particularly salient for them as individuals. For instance, how might we help a prisoner who doesn't have a place to live after they get out identify short-term housing resources in their neighborhood, while supporting another prisoner to find a job so that she has stable employment after release? Right now, we're working with an educational technology company called Adobo to design and implement a tablet-based intervention that prompts inmates to identify areas of personal concern that they have, ask them a couple additional questions like where they plan to live, whether they have kids, and then identifies specific resources, like you can see on the right, specific resources they can access in the neighborhoods they're moving back to. This infographic is provided to someone who indicates they want to continue their education, including specific resources they can access in the community to get assistance applying to college. Once inmates are released, we then send them a follow-up set of messages that remind them about those resources and invite them to write back and connect remotely with a caseworker if they need one-on-one assistance. Now, the final example I wanted to give is in the context of workforce development. Depending on the news you follow, unemployment rates certainly going down, stock market is performing at record numbers. Both of those mask the fact, however, that millions of people are still unemployed or underemployed, despite improvements to the economy. It's also the case that in many sectors there are thousands or hundreds of thousands of jobs that are unfilled. For the unemployed or underemployed workers, however, even with jobs available and posted, it can be really hard to find ones that are a good match for their prior experience and interests. And so right now in Texas, we're working on a project that combines information that we, through our partners, can obtain about individuals' workforce histories with publicly available information about job and training opportunities. And in the same way that Amazon uses data science and machine learning to tell us what products we might want to buy based on things we've bought in the past, or Netflix tells us what movies we might want to watch based on shows we've seen prior, we can provide individuals with highly tailored information about jobs that are available in their community that appear to be a good fit for their prior work experience, given the employment trajectories that similar individuals have followed in the past. So I want to wrap up turning to the VISTA programs that you all work with and ask you to share any ideas that come to mind for you for how you might apply some of these behavioral strategies, some of the toolkit approaches that I've just gone over to your VISTA project. So any ideas you have, please post in the chat box, and we'd love to hear just your initial thinking for how any of these strategies might be useful to support the individuals you work with through VISTA.
All right, so we've got the challenge there for the chat. We just heard a few really great examples, and I'm just marveling at the ingenuity of some of those and how technology is able to bring data together and make information available to people. So let's see what ideas you all have. I saw someone who'd mentioned something about being able to meet prisoners at the gate, or even start meeting with them while they're incarcerated, to start connecting with them and working directly with them. Training and internship opportunities that could be important in the area of workforce development. Using incentives to try to encourage behaviors, say like parents becoming involved with their kids or involved in the school. An idea for reducing hassles. Offer opportunities to those in need within their community instead of them having to go across town to access a service or a program. So nice way to apply this.
Great. Well, I love seeing all these ideas. And, you know, what I would say is that I want to return to a point I made at the beginning, which is that hopefully the challenges that individuals in your VISTA programs might face with complex decisions they encounter, accessing, challenges accessing beneficial resources and opportunities, following through on intentions they have for themselves or their families, those are experiences that we can all relate to because we've all had similar experiences. I think it's important, of course, to keep, as we talked about a little further back, at front of mind the way that financial scarcity and time scarcity and the other forms of scarcity that we described make those decisions, following through on one's intentions, particularly challenging for people in poverty. And so I hope that these strategies that we've gone over are ones that you feel like you can use in your VISTA programs going forward. I really want to thank Andy and Bethany very much for being able to share this webinar with all of you. As a fellow AmeriCorps alum, it's a tremendous honor to be able to be with you in the webinar. Here are a couple books that may be of interest on applying behavioral insights to education. And very shortly, actually, for those of you whose VISTA programs are working on college access or college success, in early in 2018, we'll be putting out a practitioner's guide on applying behavioral nudges to improve post-secondary educational outcomes. So stay tuned for that. And again, Andy and Bethany, thanks so much for the opportunity.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Ben. You've shared such a great wealth of information, and the way you explain it makes it so accessible and so easy to think about how we could apply it to what it is that we're doing in the VISTA program. So now we get to the point where we get to hear from you, the participants in the session, two ways. First off, we have an evaluation poll, which you can see on the right side of the screen. If you're viewing this on a computer, you'll be able to see and participate in that poll. There are 10 questions, so you'll need to use the slide bar to scroll down to get to all 10. We really do use your input. I read every evaluation that comes in. I particularly like to see your ideas for other content, other topics that you'd like to see us cover. So please feel free to do that. And now we're going to move on to the question and answer portion of the presentation. So because the poll has opened, the Q&A panel has closed. If you want to use the Q&A panel, you can click on the little caret or the little arrow next to the letters Q&A to reopen the Q&A panel. And I'm going to invite our operator, Ernest, to come back on the line to tell us how to ask a question by phone.
Thank you. We will now begin the question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question, please press *1 and record your first and last name clearly when prompted. Your name is required to introduce your question. To withdraw your question, you may press *2. Once again, if you would like to ask a question, please press *1. One moment, please, for our first question.
All right, thanks. And again, if you'd like to ask a question online, look for the Q&A panel. It will have closed because of the poll, so you'll have to reopen it, and you can submit your question there. So we have a kind of an extended comment and a question that came from Aaron. He says, I don't mean to question the dedication put into this type of analysis, but it's not surprising that initiatives like these have found favor with entities like Charles Koch Foundation. It's difficult for me not to interpret the ideas being presented as some type of research-based victim blaming. It's been long since shown that scarcity is a well-funded myth of capitalism, often told by those who are subconsciously protecting their tendencies of hoarding. My question is, despite how many individuals you can behaviorally train to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, what does this approach do to end a system that depends on a permanent underclass, that is, communities of poverty, to maintain its economic model of endless growth and exploitation? So it's a big question about capitalism and financial economic systems. So Ben, Aaron put it out there. I just want to see if you have any thoughts about how your work or how behavioral economics could play a role in this bigger question.
Yeah, well, I'll respond in two ways. I don't have an informed view on the kind of broader questions around capitalism and an underclass, so I'll leave those to others. I tend to think of this in a more pragmatic way. I agree with the point, certainly, that we need to continue to invest in more long-term systemic changes to the structure of our education system, our government, our society that promote greater equality and economic mobility. So you have a strong ally in that belief. I also believe that those will continue to be long-run fights and long-run investments we need to make. And in the very, very near term, there are millions and millions of people who have educational opportunities available to them, employment opportunities available to them that they may not be aware of. They may have trouble following through on their intentions to pursue those educational employment opportunities that have the potential to lead, help them lead the lives that they're striving for. And to the extent that we can apply decision-making insights and behavioral insights to support individuals to follow through on their own intentions, I don't think we're training people. And I think it's actually the opposite of victim blaming. I think we are trying to understand deeply the contextual factors that can make it challenging for someone to access programs or opportunities to advance their education, to pursue meaningful economic opportunity, and developing structures and strategies that are mindful of that context and make it easier for people to follow through on their intentions. Since I was a classroom teacher, since I was an AmeriCorps member, I've always been 1,000% committed to doing what we can in the moment and in the present to support people, especially those in poverty, to pursue opportunities for improved education, improved economic opportunity, and I see behavioral insights and behavioral strategies as an important element of a toolkit that enables us to do that.
All right, thank you for that, Ben. Moving on, we've got a question that came in from Rachel. She says, you mentioned that youth struggle with developmental scarcity, you know, the whole adolescent brain and all that. What are some tips that you have to help them overcome this so that they can make good decisions for their future?
Well, it's a great question. You know, I think with more affluent families, I think parents do this with a differing levels of consciousness, but I think parents in more affluent families, because of time and financial resources available to them, tend to, especially think about something like the college application process, tend to implicitly provide an accommodation for the fact that their adolescent's developmental brain is at a point where it's incredibly responsive to impulses and just beginning to, you know, have the cognitive capacity for longer-term reasoning. And so your parents provide a lot of reminders. They work with kids on more complex things like applying for financial aid. They pester them to do tasks. And that just kind of happens, and we don't really question it. Whereas for kids in less affluent families, families with less educational experience, I never think for a minute their parents love them any less or care any less about their well-being, but they may face many more demands on their time. They may have many more stresses around finances. They may have much less experience with education. And so what it says to me is that if we're okay and we recognize that parents of more affluent adolescents are providing a level of support and guidance and reminders and prompts and assistance, that there is a policy argument to be made for figuring out how to do so for kids who are just as smart and hardworking, who experience just the same adolescent tendencies to respond to impulses and to struggle with more longer-term planning, and figure out how to provide those students with similar information, assistance, guidance, and support.
All right, thanks. And just a side note, a couple people have asked to be reminded, when we talk about low SES families or individuals, we're talking about low socioeconomic status. So just a reminder there about some terminology. Ernest, let's check on the phones and see if we have any questions there.
At this time, we're showing no questions. If you would like to ask a question, please press *1. Record your first and last name clearly when prompted. Your name is required to introduce your question. To withdraw your question, you may press *2. Once again, if you would like to ask a question, please press *1.
Okay, thanks. We've got a few more questions here lined up in the Q&A. Jessica asks, what effect can we trace to adverse childhood experiences in terms of how cognitive abilities are impaired or perhaps economic decision-making is being impaired?
It's a great question. It's not one that I, unfortunately, claim expertise to offer an informed answer on. My intuition would be that there's probably a fairly strong link from adverse experience as a child, and then decision-making processes and responses a young person then has as an adolescent. But I unfortunately can't offer a more informed view than that.
Okay. All right. Well, we can't expect you to be an expert in everything. Next up, Helen says, I certainly believe that prompt strategies are effective. However, how can you use prompt strategies like reminders but not have it increase dependency rather than empowering individuals to remind themselves and to create independence?
That's a fantastic question. You know, I would distinguish two broad classes of decisions that we might use prompts for. I'm very focused in my own thinking and work on what I think of as kind of critical transitions, critical junctures students encounter in their lives. So, you know, I originally started on this work thinking about the transition from high school to college, where students in a 3-month period face a very complicated set of decisions, and the results of those can bear large influence on whether they go to college at all. I tend to think that that's the kind of clearest argument for using prompts, because it's reminding students to navigate a concrete, discrete, time-bounded decision in their lives. And if they get through that decision point, they then get on, you know, they go on to college, they're in an academic environment that's more familiar, and they're then hopefully positioned for success. And so I think I worry less about the dependency issue there. With something like, say, getting students to do their homework or exercise more or study, whatever it might be, I don't have a good answer for you. I in fact, was talking to a very prominent, very accomplished social psychologist about just this issue, and she's starting to do, think about work using reminders to encourage homework completion. And I do think there's some potential that it could, you know, create some level of dependency. My guess is the effective way to do it would be to start out with, you know, kind of just reminder, do your homework, but have an intentional plan in mind to transition and sequence that towards plan making. So if the first, I'm overly simplifying this, but if in the first few weeks it's do your homework, in the next few weeks there's some very strong research showing the benefit of prompting people to make more concrete plans. So you could imagine shifting to say, you know, when have you found you are most productive with your homework? What times of day, what days of the week? What are the environments in which you are most productive? With that in mind, what's the kind of ideal homework plan for you for the coming week? So I think with that kind of shift in mind, where there might be some initial prompts, but then there's an intentionality about using outreach as a way of helping students develop their own plans and implementation intentions, I think that might be an effective way to approach it.
Great. Good advice. And you may have seen the next question up from Jeffrey says, do you have any advice on building the self-control muscle? So kind of related to what you were just talking about, but anything further that you'd share for the individual who wants to build their own self-control or self-motivation?
Yeah, you know, it's a fantastic question. So this is actually one way in which, especially for an individual who has that intention, I think there's a variety of technology tools that can be really helpful. So certainly for young people, I think that, I mean, for all of us, but young people in particular, I think, you know, phones, tablets are a tremendous source of distraction. And so I think, you know, making sure young people are aware of tools they can use that limit their time on devices, block access to certain sites when the individual is trying to work on their homework, making sure they're aware of those tools. You know, one of my favorite websites for this is called Stick, STICKK.com, and it's a website where you can set a goal, publicly set a goal that you're trying to achieve, but you also make a financial commitment to it. So let's say that I was trying not to bite my nails, which is kind of a perennial challenge for me. I would go on this website and say, I will not bite my nails, and I would nominate someone, my wife, to be a referee, who once a week I would have to log on and say I didn't do it, and she would have to log on and confirm that I didn't. And before I started, I would make a commitment to say, if I bite my nails, I will give $500 to an entity I detest. So in my case, something like the New York Yankees with no intent of offending anyone on the call. the idea of making a public commitment where you have someone who is holding you accountable and you have made a financial stake that would feel painful to kind of let go of is a strategy to kind of to control our commitments, to adhere to our commitments. So if there are goals that anyone or intentions anyone on the webinar is wanting to adhere to but maybe struggling to do so, I strongly encourage you to check out stickk.com.
All right, thank you very much. Let's see, next up, Kalima asks, my main concern is program effectiveness. In my limited experience, I've seen organizations get rewarded with lots of money with minimal to no strings attached, while other organizations that are developing real measurable results are suffering from a lack of funds. It's not really a question there, but just, oh, here we go. So is there a way to develop more influenced evidence-based metrics towards universal goals of resources and poverty?
I'm not sure I can speak to the broader question, although I think it's very well taken. I will say that one of the things I really appreciate about the kind of my colleagues doing work in behavioral economics and public policy is there's a very strong tradition of rigorously evaluating the behaviorally informed strategies and solutions that we develop. Almost all of the work, the strategies I showed you were evaluated through randomized trials, the same way that we're accustomed to medications being evaluated prior to us taking them. And so in service of evidence-based policy, I think that there's much of the work in behavioral economics and policy has a rigorous evidence base behind it. And so, for organizations like VISTA programs thinking about potentially adopting them, there's often evidence to look to for whether these strategies are effective or not. And certainly, I think the broader point that I personally feel it's incredibly important that we invest in rigorously evaluating strategies to alleviate poverty so that we know what works and can direct resources appropriately.
All right, thank you. Next up, Corey asks, how do you prompt the parents in low socioeconomic status to seek out a mentorship when it's not legally compelled? And how might you prompt them to make a long-term commitment, say in a situation when classes are being ordered by a court?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question.
Well, yeah, I'm trying to read between the lines here too. It sounds like she's, perhaps working in programming around parents who, in some cases, may be court-ordered to attend classes or to commit to other types of activities. Perhaps related to their children, maybe not, it's not clear here. But then in other cases, it seems that there's this opportunity for them to get mentoring, but it's not compelled, it's not legally compelled. Yeah. And so it's hard for them to get parents to participate in that type of service.
Yeah, well, I kind of trust the person posing the question that is the case, and I can understand it would be for some parents. My read of the research literature applying behavioral insight strategies to engage parents is that across numerous studies, when parents are proactively reached out to with information or resources or strategies that they can use to the benefit of their children's education, the pre-literacy strategies I described earlier, sending parents information about missed assignments or missed days of school, that in many studies, parents respond very actively and positively to that outreach. They engage more with their children and with their children's school, and that in turn leads to improved performance for their kids. So my own assessment is that in general, parents don't need to be compelled. Parents are quite responsive to being engaged with their children. And and perhaps it's a matter of kind of the ways in which we're reaching out, the kinds of information we're providing, and the kind of guidance or support we give to parents for how they might effectively engage to support their children going forward.
All right, thanks. So next up, Tammy talks about cognitive capacity. She says, we all have cognitive capacity, but there are still low literacy and low digital literacy among poor populations. And that low literacy can inhibit people from applying for a job, accessing benefits like food stamps, or finding child care. Any ideas on how to remove these barriers? They seem to be systemic and start from childhood.
Yeah, I wish I had better advice on how to remove those barriers. This question, I think a related question at least, comes up a lot with some of the work that we do around financial aid. And this may be a bit of a loose connection, but it made me think of this. There's a very valid argument to be made that instead of reminding people to fill out the federal free application for federal financial aid, the FAFSA, and providing them assistance with the FAFSA, why don't we just get rid of the FAFSA or make it really simple? I would like to see more efforts by governments, by communities to streamline processes and to eliminate barriers in the first place. My own observation of the last 10, 11 months is that, unfortunately, I think barriers are becoming more pronounced, at least federally, not less, in accessing important social programs and resources. So I think it's a very important question. I'm not sure I have great insights in how to do it. I will say, not so much at the federal level right now, but aside from the kind of very concrete direct-to-individual outreach strategies that I mentioned in the presentation, I've been very impressed by the receptivity of state and local governments to incorporate behavioral economists, behavioral scientists into government, to kind of diagnose at the state or local level behavioral obstacles in government processes that people have to go through, and to explore ways to simplify those. So I see this actually as a trend at the state and local level that I think has some real promise.
All right, great, thanks. Let's go back to the phones. Ernest, do we have any callers on the line?
No, sir. At this time, we're still showing no questions.
All right. Well, that brings us to the end of the questions we have in the Q&A. Well, let's see. Well, it looks like we've got some folks putting comments in the Q&A. Remember, if you want your colleagues to see your comments, put them in the chat so that everyone will be able to see that. All right. Well, let's call it a wrap. Ben, I want to thank you so much for your tremendous presentation today, and I want to thank everyone for participating. We hope you can join us again for another webinar. We've got 3 opportunities coming up for you in December. You can see those listed on your screen. You'll also be receiving emails with registration links for each of those sessions. It's been my pleasure to have with us today Dr. Ben Castleman, who's an Assistant Professor of Education and Public Policy at the University of Virginia. I also want to thank my colleagues, the production team at Education Northwest, Bethany DeSablin, Joanne Lau, and Scott Weinrobe for their support and technical assistance during the program. Thank you all.